Hey, what's up? John Somez here, and I've got another interview for you guys today. This one I'm really excited about. Who I have today is an author of a book that I did a review on a while back. I know a lot of you had recommended that I read this book as I was reading a lot of stuff involved with sort of like Eastern philosophy and sort of this kind of one consciousness type of material. And so you recommended this book called My Big Toe, or My Big Theory of Everything. And I read the book. I was very interested by some of the things that that Tom had said in this book, and so graciously Tom has agreed to do an interview, to have us chat with me here on the channel. So welcome, Tom Campbell.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So yeah, I'm excited to ask you a bunch of questions. It's so such a good opportunity to be able to pick someone's mind who really is has I'd say, you know, that when I read your book, the biggest thing that I felt like that I really liked about it was that you have this skeptical viewpoint of traditional science, like of scientists that just like accept these explanations for things that just don't make sense, which I love. So but maybe before we get into it, just for people that don't know who you are, maybe if you want to give a little bit of an intro of who you are and what you do.
Okay. Name's Tom Campbell. I'm a physicist, and my career in physics and a career in consciousness research both started at about the same time, which is in the early 1970s, shortly after I got out of graduate school. And my career in consciousness started with around that time with Bob Monroe, author of Journeys Out of the Body, Far Journeys, and Ultimate Journey. And I happened to bump into Bob Monroe, and he had just built a lab for studying consciousness. He was a guy who had out-of-body experiences and didn't want to have them, tried not to have them, but he did anyway. So he played with them because it scared him half to death. He thought he might be going insane and so on. But after consulting a shrink and getting a little time to get himself together, he decided he would just see what he could do. And then he wrote the book, Journeys Out of the Body. But he wanted to understand this out-of-body phenomena as science. He didn't want to be just a strange old guy that had funny experiences. He wanted to put it on the map as decent science. So he had built this lab to study consciousness, but it was one of those build it and they will come sort of things. He didn't really know what he was going to do with it.
Right.
And I just happened to drop in at about that time. And being a physicist, he asked me and a friend of mine that also met him at the same time, an electrical engineer, whether or not we would like to work in his lab. So we made a deal. We said, all right, we'll be your free science help, and you teach us what you know about going out of body, because if we don't experience it, then we won't be able to understand it. If we don't want to just be studying you, we want to be studying a consciousness phenomena, and for that we have to have our own experience with it. So he agreed, and that started about 15 to 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe. All of it was in the evening, into the wee hours of the morning. We'd get there maybe 7 o'clock in the evening after dinner, and we'd stay until 1 or 2 o'clock at night working with Bob, him teaching us, we building equipment in the lab and getting it set to do real experiments. So that's kind of how I got started as a consciousness researcher. So my physics career continued during the day,
Right.
and my consciousness research career continued at the night. So I'm one of these guys that had two jobs, a night job and a day job, but only the day job paid. The
Right.
rest one was just to see what I could find out, to see what I could understand. And I was very skeptical about Bob because I didn't really know him. I wanted to know, is this guy on the straight, or is he just trying to sell books?
Right.
So once I got to know him, I know that he was a straight shooter. He was just who he was, doing what he always did, which was try to understand the things that happened to him. So he was a very wealthy guy. I lived on this palatial estate on a big white house on the hill. You drive in his driveway, and there's whiteboard fence with horses, galloping alongside your car as you drive in. So he obviously didn't need the money, from selling books. That wasn't his thing. Books wasn't even pocket change for him. So it wasn't about the money. It was about trying to understand what had happened. So I worked with Bob for best part of a decade. Eventually, Dennis and I came up with a technology for helping naive subjects attain a really good meditation state. And we did a lot of research there. And being the physicist, I was supposed to come up with the theory. How does it work? Why does it work that way? Dennis was more of an equipment guy because he was the double E. So he helped us design and build equipment. So that was early 1970s up through about toward the end of the 1970s. It got so popular, so many people came and wanted to try out this new technology for having out-of-body experiences that Dennis and I turned into trainers rather than researchers, because it was just too many people wanted to get involved in it. So we kind of slipped out the back because we really didn't want to be trainers. We wanted to do the research. But by then, most of the research was really done. We'd kind of come to our conclusions, and now all I had to do was figure it out. So I spent the next 30 years, 35 years trying to figure it out, doing research on my own. I still was on the board of directors of Monroe Institute, and I'd see them every year or so. But other than that, we split company in around 1980 or so, late 70s. So that's what a nice physicist like me is doing in a place like out of body experience and consciousness research and that sort of thing. Eventually, I wrote a book, actually 3 books. It started out as 1 book, just got too fat for 1 book, so it ended up in 3 books explaining reality and consciousness. And I knew that physics was a subset of consciousness. I knew that consciousness was fundamental and everything else derived from there. I had figured out that much in my travels because by then I could go out of body just whenever I wanted to, on demand, and my states were very stable and I could return to the same place over and over again. So I could actually do research there. I could, modify a variable and then see how that modified the experience. So after 35 years of doing that, I thought I understood the larger consciousness system. I thought I understood that it was primary. So I write these books about consciousness, a theory of consciousness, and about a year or 2 after they were published, I realized that the very same um, logic that explained consciousness also would explain the mysteries in physics. I'm a physicist. I should have picked that up earlier, but it was about 2 years after they were published. And I realized that I could explain quantum mechanics, why particles were probability distributions.
Right.
Whereas physicists can't explain that. They have no idea. They just start with that assumption and go from there, but they don't know why, that assumption should be true. And then I looked at relativity, because quantum mechanics and relativity are like the 2 big things in physics. Those 2 cover everything else. So I looked at relativity, and the big mystery there was, why is c, the speed of light, a constant? Again, they start with that as an assumption, but don't have any idea why that ought to be true. And I could solve both of those mysteries: why particles are best described as probability distributions, and why the speed of light's a constant. It was just simple. It fell right out of the same logic that was creating my consciousness theory. So then I started looking at the other paradoxes in physics.
Right.
There's lots of paradoxes in physics, things that we know work like that, but we don't know why, like tunneling, like a Zeno effect, like what happened where did the Big Bang come from? Why did that little ball of plasma just suddenly appear there and then turn into our universe? You see, that doesn't make any sense. So there's all of these paradoxes in physics, probably about a dozen or so of them that have been kind of around for a century, that nobody really has a clue why things are like that. And the theory of consciousness explained all of them. So it's better science as well as better metaphysics. And so then I wrote some experiments, quantum mechanics experiments, that would verify what it is I was saying. And I have these experiments. There's 6 experiments actually, but each one has sub-experiments. So it's like experiment 1 and 1A and 1B and 1C and so on. But there's 6 primary experiments. And I published those in 2016 in a talk I gave in Los Angeles. And all of this is on YouTube, by the way. So if you want to look at those experiments, they're all at MBTLA 2016. That's, I
Okay.
think, the name of the video on YouTube, if anybody'd like to look at them. So
And
I
we'll put
have
a
these.
link there too. We'll put a link in the description for that.
Okay,
So,
good. So then now I'm trying to find people to do the experiments,
yeah.
and I'm working on that. I'm going to have a Kickstart thing go off in about a month to help fund them, because money talks everywhere, including
Yeah.
universities. you
True.
know Scientists have their own things they're doing. They have their grants, and they can't work with that grant money doing anything other than what their grant was about. And so everybody's busy, but if you have enough money to add to the pie, then somehow people find time to work on your project rather than the one that they're working on.
Right.
So we're trying to raise a little money to convince scientists to do those experiments. And what those experiments will show, if they turn out the way that I predict them, it'll show clearly, one, that this is a virtual reality and not a basically mass, matter, time, charge sort of thing. It's not. It's not that. It's virtual. It still has time in it. Time is fundamental. But anyway, it'll show that this is a virtual reality. That means a computed reality. That our reality is based on information. That's the same thing as saying a virtual reality. And it will also demonstrate that consciousness is the computer.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so it'll do both of those. Now, it'll be very strong evidence about this being a virtual reality, and it'll be less strong, but still good evidence that consciousness is the computer. So that's kind of where I come from, how I got to where I am today, and what I'm doing now is trying to get those experiments done. I'd like to get them done by a good, reputable physics department someplace in a major university. So that's what I'm working on. So maybe in another 6 months or a year, when they get done, then it'll be a whole different ball game. If they work out the way I think, it will change everything. Science will not be the same thing anymore. Physics will be completely have to be rethought. And physics is like the fundamental science. Physics
Sure. Yeah.
explains chemistry, and chemistry and physics together explain biology. And it's kind of at the root. The only thing that it is a little lower down on the food chain and in science is mathematics. That's kind of mathematics is the subset of physics. Is the substrate of the foundation really of physics. So in any case, that will change everything, and it not only will change science, but I think it will change the world in general. It'll change attitudes,
Sure. Yeah.
because when scientists come out and say that this is a virtual reality, okay, we have experimental proof. They already have some experimental proof that this is not material, but they don't have solid proof yet that this is a virtual reality. When they get that, then that's a big game changer, saying that our physical universe is a subset of something more fundamental, and that more fundamental thing exists in a reality frame that's non-physical to ours.
Right.
Because you
Yeah.
see, a virtual reality can't contain its own computer. Like the World of Warcraft virtual reality, the computer that computes it can't be inside of the World of Warcraft. It has
Right.
to be outside the World of Warcraft. And like we are the consciousness of the say we're playing World of Warcraft and we're playing an elf. We're that elf's consciousness. We're the one that makes all the elf's choices, whether to run or fight or dance or whatever we want him to do. We are the consciousness, and the consciousness and the computer have to talk to each other all the time.
Right.
The consciousness is saying, elf, run away. Well, then the computer that computes that elf needs to show a picture of that elf running away and compute all the consequences of that happening. You see, so the computer and the consciousness have to be outside of the virtual reality that is created. Well, from inside the virtual reality, you think if you're inside the virtual reality, then the virtual reality seems physical. That means the computer and the conscious have to be non-physical. This thing about physical and non-physical, it's just a matter of the observer. Wherever you are, wherever your awareness is, that seems physical. When you're dreaming, that dream seems physical. Seems like
That's
it's
true.
a
Yeah.
physical monster chasing you off the edge of that physical cliff, and you're going to fall and smash your physical body when you hit the bottom. unless you wake up first. But in any case, it seems physical, and this reality is non-physical there. So not physical and non-physical is just depends on where the observer is. Wherever the observer is, that's physical. That's, whatever reality the observer's in, the observer sees that reality as physical, and other realities seem non-physical. So here we
Right.
are. Here we are in a virtual reality. Our bodies are avatars. We are consciousness playing those avatars, and we are non-physical. Consciousness is non-physical to the virtual reality, and so is the computer. The computer is a subset of consciousness, and we as individuated units of consciousness are also a subset of that same, what I call larger consciousness system. So that's just in a thumbnail, a very quick, broad brush of, of how all this falls out. Now there's hundreds of logical implications of that go in all sorts of directions. And I guess I'll take your lead of what direction you want to go in.
Well, I think first, I think a lot of people right now that are watching that aren't familiar with any of this, their minds just got blown. They're like, what the heck just happened here? Because at least that was my first, when I first read your book, I was like, wait a minute here. And then it was interesting too, because I think, it's become more of a popular theory with, I think Elon Musk had been talking about the possibility of this being in a virtual reality. And then for the first time, people were like, oh, wait, this could actually be true. And then, you've had this theory for a long time, way longer than that, I think. So let's start like just with, okay. So one thing that kind of appealed to me as well is this idea that, like, I mean, you were very analytical, very skeptical, especially of Monroe starting out, and you detailed that in your book. I was very analytical. I was a software developer for a long time. I've since kind of expanded my mindset a little bit, I would say, but there's still going to be a lot of people that are like very resistant to out of body experience, and saying that no, this is, they're going to basically dismiss everything because they're going to say, this is gibberish. This doesn't make any sense. This is crazy. How do you address that? Like, how do we know that out of body experiences are real things? Like, what is the biggest, I don't know, what is the biggest argument, or what's the biggest thing that you would say that to address those people?
Well, first of all, I would tell them that they should be skeptical, and their skeptical attitude is a good attitude. If it's not your experience, it's not your truth. So
True.
if you've not experienced an out of body, then there's no way that you can verify that an out of body is something that actually exists. Okay, so there's no problem with our attitude being like that. Matter of fact, it is exactly the way it should be. That's true of all the things that we call paranormal. The remote viewing, telepathy, all these things that people study. And if you really want to look for scientific evidence of these things, and I say evidence, there is no proof in science. We gave up
Right.
proof back in the 19 or 1800s when Newton said, these are laws. Here's the Newton's first law and second law and third law. Well, we found out they really weren't laws. They were just pieces of a bigger picture.
Sure.
And science doesn't talk about proof and laws anymore. It talks about theory and evidence. So if you're looking for evidence, you can find it on the web anywhere. Google remote viewing or Google out of body, and look at there's not been that much research in out of body because it's almost all subjective. You see, so
Right.
there's not a way to get a good handle on that. It's just your own personal experience. So if you have the experiences and you play with them like Bob Monroe did, and you experiment with them, then you'll know that it's true. If you haven't, then you should be skeptical. But now things like remote viewing, where there is clear evidence, you either get the target right or you don't get the target right. It's very simple. So that's a place where you have a lot of objective evidence. And if you go on the web, you'll find a half dozen places studying remote viewing, have been doing it for a decade or more, and their scientific protocols are very strong, probably stronger than most science has done. They only give remote viewers targets that are triple blind. That means somebody makes up a bunch of targets, they give them to somebody else independently, who then um, say puts one in each envelope and numbers the envelopes, and then they have a third person who randomly picks out of that pile, of envelopes, and then he holds that envelope up and asks the remote viewer, tell me, what exists at the coordinates that are in this envelope. Nobody ever opens the envelope.
Right. Okay.
Okay. From when it was first sealed in, it never gets open and passes through three independent people's hands. So there's very little room for collusion. It's really strong, very strong scientific rigor. And you'll see that good remote viewers will get it right, 85, 90% of the time. So, and they will get it to a level of exactness that cannot be sloughed off as, good luck or, great imagination or that kind of stuff. They'll describe something and draw it right down to the spokes on the wagon wheel. They'll have a very good image of it. So if you want, if you want evidence that these things are real, just go look up remote viewing. Look at the placebo effect. The placebo effect is
That's
another
yeah.
paranormal. It's another paranormal thing. Now nobody calls it paranormal
True.
because we've accepted that.
Right.
You can't sell drugs if they don't beat the placebo effect. So it's part of our law even, but it
Yeah.
is a paranormal thing. What it says is that if you give people a suggestion that their health is going to get better, their health will get better. About 35% of the people, their health will get better. And this is above and beyond, statistically significant. So it's not like it just happened once and somebody made this up. It's like this has been studied for, probably 50, 60 years now. And
That's a
it
good point. Yeah.
does change the state of their health way beyond what any statistics are. So they have control groups. The control group didn't get the positive suggestion about their health, and they can tell the differences between them, and the differences are very much meaningful, statistically. So that's look up the placebo effect. That is another paranormal event where mind affects body, affects health.
Now,
It's
what about one thing I always question with remote viewing is if people are able to do it, then why are we not in it seems to me, it follows to me that you would have a lot of people that would be using it for gains, for I mean, if you can see something remotely, if you can have an out of body experience and see, or would you not be able to glean information like stock market information, or secretive information that
yeah.
would give you a huge financial advantage in life?
Well, probably not stock market, since you're just reviewing what is rather than what will be. You're not looking into you can
Well, like
remote view into the future,
yeah.
but basically you don't have a lot of people doing it because it takes a lot of practice to be able to do it.
Okay.
Okay? It's not something that just everybody will do well. Now, everybody can learn how to do it, but most people won't. Just like everybody can learn how to play a piano,
Okay.
good enough to play in an orchestra, perhaps, but most of us won't because it's too much trouble, takes too long, and it's a lot of hard work, and we'd rather drink beer and go party or do something else rather than spend 5 hours a day practicing the piano. So it's a similar thing. Remote
Okay.
viewing can be done, and there's lots of evidence for those people who have learned how to do it. And it's not that they are somehow different than other humans because they've learned how. Anybody could learn how, but it takes time and patience and a lot of work to get good at it.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that it's not something that you do with your intellect. Matter of fact, the intellect has to be gotten rid of. This all has to come from what I call the being level. And a lot of people have a real hard time trying to figure out what that is, what this being level is relative to their intellect. Because we, particularly in Western culture, tend to work out of our heads. Our
Right.
intellect is like the main thing. That's how we run our life. Well, that intellect will not succeed at remote viewing because that's not how it works. You have to get at a level of consciousness that's outside the intellect. And that takes a little practice how to get there. I guess the first step in that practice is to learn how to meditate and get into a really good meditation state and hold that, stable in a theta state. Be the state theta being a brainwave. It's a thing you measure with an EEG,
Right.
electrodes on your head, and there's alpha, theta, delta. There's lots of things there. The different frequencies have names. So the theta state is the state just before you generally fall asleep. It's in that very low frequency at around 4 hertz or so. You get down to 2 hertz, that's delta, and that is unconscious. That's when you're unconscious. And you slip back up into theta when you dream, uh, and sometimes even up into alpha when you dream. But anyway, so those are skills that you have to learn how to do this. So
Okay.
it's not
Yeah.
just that everybody walking around is going to do it. Now, can these practitioners do that? Yes, they can. But because it's not only that it has to be from the being level, but this being level um, is has to be, can I say this? Has to be more caring, more love based, um, more positive than negative, than ego, than I'm going to find an advantage. So, for instance, there's a guy who teaches remote viewing, and
Mhm.
he will routinely have a class at Las Vegas, and they learn. And he teaches also psychokinetics. I guess this is one I'm talking about. There's one remote viewing and psychokinetics. Well, the one that does psychokinetics, they can make the dice come up, let's say, pairs, get the same number on each die. They can change the probability of these things happening. Now, it doesn't work 100%. They're not controlling the dice with their mind. They just change the probability of what comes up, but they can move that probability a bit in their favor. And they generally will get together, practice, then they'll go out on the tables and they win a lot of money. But before they start, they've already designated a charity to which the money will be given to.
Oh, I see.
You
Interesting.
see?
Interesting.
So that's how they keep themselves able to do this. There's a moral component to it. To really have power at the being level where these things are affected, you need to have a very positive, other-centered attitude rather than a self-centered attitude. The
Interesting.
self-centered attitude takes you right back into the fear, ego, intellect game. You see,
Yeah.
it's not,
Okay.
it runs you back to the intellect where nothing works. So in order to keep this uh, process at the being level where it's helpful, it has to be positive rather than negative. It has to be caring, rather than self-centered. So that's part of it. Now you can be self-centered and still learn to do these things somewhat, but you'll never be really, really good at it. You'll be so at it.
Right.
So that's, yeah, it does work, and people can do that. They can modify how the dice come up, and they can remote view things. I was with a group of people a year or so ago in Las Vegas who were remote viewing the future, and then of sports teams,
ah,
outcomes of sports events, and then placing their bets based on what they remote viewed. And they had a very clever little method for doing that, and they were mostly very successful. And but they were doing really small bets. They were mostly wanted to see, could they do it? That was the point. Not how much money they could make, but just enough to show that they could do it. So they were experimenting. So yes, you can do those things with these abilities, but it's not something that everybody's going to do. You can heal others and yourself, just like the same way you do the placebo effect. You can do a placebo effect that's a lot stronger. And the reason you can do these things is that it's a long story. It'd take me this whole time just to explain the details of this, but it's all logical.
right.
Honest guys, I'm not just making this up. This all comes out of a very logical theory. But the reason that you can do these things is that a focused intent from the being level modifies future probability.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah.
so that's part of the way that uh, what's the word, that we can affect, that we can change our reality. So
Right.
we can't make the reality be whatever we want, but we have some ways that we can control in some ways what it is. And one of those ways is that our intent modifies future probability. What's likely to happen next, those probabilities of how likely it is will change based on
Right.
our intent. And you can see this in your everyday life. People who tend to be very positive,
Yeah.
upbeat, happy, smiley, they go through life like, wow, another day, this is going to be fun. And you
Exactly.
find that mostly good things happen to them. They get the breaks, the stuff falls their way. And the sad sacks that are oh, woe is me. The only luck I have is bad luck, and nothing ever works for me. And you hear people, then they complain and moan all the time. Well,
Yeah.
they get a lot of crap comes their way. They get a lot of negative stuff. That's because they create the change in probabilities. One creates the probabilities positive things coming with their intent. The other one creates a higher probability of the negative stuff coming because of their intent. So that's just the way it works. When you heal with your mind, you just change the probable future. And you can only change that probable future in terms of probability, not
Right.
exactly. You can't make something happen. You can only change the probability that it'll happen. So if
Interesting.
you ha-
Yeah.
so if you have a lot of uncertainty, like you do with medical things, because our biology is not well understood, so people do a lot of strange things as far as healing goes. You can have some guy that's got stage 4 cancer, and he wakes up the next day and it's gone. These things happen. They're not routine, but they do happen, and that creates a lot of uh,
Variability in the.
yeah, a lot of variability. But the word is, it's a lot of uncertainty. So
Mhm.
you can only change things within the natural uncertainty of the problem.
I
You
see.
can't make something happen that isn't able to happen, or that is impossible to happen. You can't do the impossible. You can only modify the probability to make some things more or less likely. So
Right.
you make the disease getting worse less likely, and the disease getting better more likely, and then that is often what happens. So there's a lot of details, and there's a lot of physics and logic that goes into this, but I'm just skipping across the top for your readers
Yeah.
because we don't have the time to go into derivations. We only have the time to kind of talk about some of the possibilities and hope that your readers get interested enough to read more about it.
Yeah, they should definitely read for everyone watching, read Tom's book, read The Big Theory of Everything, because it does like this is one of the things that I found fascinating. It's like all of these things, right? Like in the entrepreneur world, right? We have books like Think and Grow Rich. We talk about things like positive affirmations or self-fulfilling prophecies. And it's kind of, some people it's woo-woo out there, right? Kind of, some people say, oh, this doesn't work, but I've found this to work in my life for sure. Definitely, I've had a lot more success when I have, and the whole idea of being, right. One of the things I teach when I'm coaching is this idea of like connecting with your like being instead of doing, and how much that like empowers you when you're not in your head. And so like what I think is really cool is just like how Tom is able to connect all of these things together with a real theory, which makes sense based on if this world is a virtual reality, and it like connects all the dots, including some of the things, like Tom said in physics, the things like I thought it was just fascinating with the whole quantum. I've always been so skeptical of science of when things like at the quantum physics level, especially when it's
Mm-hmm.
like the wave particle duality, and it's like it feels like you're just making up an explanation for this. Like you don't really understand this. Like
Yeah,
this is what I mean, and
yeah,
the whole dark matter. I'm the
yeah,
same thing. I'm like dark. That doesn't make any sense. Like you're just trying to make things fit to your equation. It doesn't like but the whole
yeah,
world takes this as face value as truth because scientists say it, but it's really just a bunch of confused people that have no idea what's going on, and they're trying to fit
yeah.
things into their to their worldview. And so I
Yeah, that's
really
correct.
appreciate that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's what they're doing. They have their beliefs, and when something doesn't match up with their belief, well, then they add a fudge factor
Yeah.
to make it add up. That's then they feel good again because then their belief still is good to go. So yes, that's exactly what they're doing. Yeah, in quantum mechanics, you say that there's a wave function. A wave function travels through all space and has probabilities of someplace. You take a measurement and you get one of those probabilities that the particle will be at that place, and that sort of thing. Well, there is no wave function. That's not what's going on. Heisenberg had an alternative quantum mechanics formulation. It doesn't have any wave functions in it at all.
Right.
It's a wave function is just a metaphor. There
Yeah.
is no wave. There is no wave function. There are no particles. Matter
No.
of fact, that's what was his name? Um, um, oh, let's see. Starts with a W. John Archibald Wheeler. John
Uh-huh.
Archibald Wheeler was a very powerful physicist. Most of the physicists that that we've heard of their names later were his students, and he came up with a lot of original stuff. So probably one of the most effective and brilliant scientists, physicists of all time here. And he's the one that created the little bullet of it from bit, meaning the universe, everything from bits, from information.
Right.
And
Yeah.
he describes his evolution in physics. He says, in the beginning, I thought everything were particles. And then I realized that couldn't possibly be true. And then I thought everything was waves. And then I realized that couldn't possibly be true. And now I realize that everything is just information. So
Right.
he said this 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So
And
uh,
it
that's
makes
the
so much sense. Like to me, when I'm thinking about just from a computer, being a software developer myself, like the universe has to contain so much data if it's all material. But if it's a virtual reality and it's rendered on the fly, then it's like greatly reduces the computation power
absolutely.
required, right? It's like
Yeah.
these
Right.
things. Yeah.
Look at No Man's Sky, and
Mhm.
see how that's done. It's not new. Now it's about a year and a half, 2 years old. But No Man's Sky does thing called procedural programming where everything's computed on the fly. It
Right.
just takes a little bit of random numbers to generate a world, and it's got a quintillion planets in its universe, more
Exactly.
than
Yeah.
anybody would ever be able to explore. Even if there were hundreds of thousands of users, they wouldn't be able to explore all of these planets, and every one of them is around the size of the Earth, and it's got its own kind of critters, its own kind of vegetation, its own ecology, and as soon as you look away from whatever you're looking at, it just it's no longer rendered, it's no longer computed.
Right.
You
And they
only
don't even have
compute.
to compute the planet until you get there, right? It's
No,
like,
right, none
right.
of it. Matter of fact, the people who did usually these programs, these virtual reality programs like World of Warcraft, they had probably a team of hundreds and hundreds of programmers that
Right.
programmed that, and they did it on big, fast computers. And this thing that's quintillions of whole worlds, that was done on a normal sized computer by 4 kids.
Right.
It doesn't have to have all that program, because it's not programmed. It's procedurally generated on the
Exactly.
fly, so you don't have to generate that. But of course, those people who created it have no idea what's on those planets. They
Right.
only know that something will come up there, and they had to go out and explore their own world before they could even tell other people much about what their game was about.
Right.
So yeah, they had to go be the users first to figure out what it was about, because they know that it should have rendered things like that. But until some user goes there, nothing's rendered at all. So
Exactly.
that's just the way our reality is. It's not a lot of the materialists, of course, they think, well, if it's a simulation, then you got to start with particles. You got to start with elementary particles, and then from then you build up atoms, and then from atoms you build up molecules, and then molecules you build up the material world. And wow, what a lot of computation that would be. But that's not the
Exactly.
way it's done. That's a
No.
bottoms up deterministic simulation, which is absurd for this reality. But if you look at a probabilistic top-down simulation with a rule set that defines what can happen here, sort of the definition of the energy exchanges that can take place in this reality, our physical universe, then you see that it's simple. Suddenly,
Yeah.
you don't have to compute all this detail to get to something. All you have to do is make, random draws out of probability distributions, and you can determine everything. So you suddenly the computational load is a billionth of what it would be if you were trying to do a bottoms up deterministic simulation. So it's just not that way. It's a probabilistic simulation.
Yeah. And it makes so much sense too, when you think about it. It's like it's kind of funny because I think a lot of people, I mean, there's definitely a lot of people that are going to be skeptics for sure, which, on that are going to think that both you and I are crazy. But the thing is, like, I kept going back to, and I'm not 100%. So I mean, just so everyone knows, like, I'm not 100. I don't know for sure, right? I'm just open to these ideas because they make a
Yeah,
lot of sense.
as
But
you should be.
but the thing when I go back to it, it's like, okay, so I'm either going to accept, like either way, and this is I think one of the things that really stuck with me that you said in your book was the concept of belief, right? Like this idea that like it's like if we just took the particles, right? Either it's like you slice an atom, you go down to or to to electrons and protons, and then you go down to the quantum level to quarks, and then but then you keep on trying to cut it, like it has to be composed of smaller and smaller part.
Hmm.
Like how far does that go? Like that's a it's a like it doesn't make any sense. Like but a virtual reality explanation does make sense. Then suddenly that makes sense. Or even like going back in time to the Big Bang and where did thing and what happened right before that. And that stuff doesn't, like, we have to accept certain beliefs that are kind of crazy, right? Like all these things are, or like, how, what is eternity? Like all these questions that we have, I think that we just like assume that there's this that they're true, but we avoid the question, like, of going all the way back where it doesn't make any sense at all. Where and so it's almost the same thing. I was thinking, like, it's like, well, this explanation makes more sense, at least for all the, like, it's still a leap of faith either way, right? You're either going to take a leap of faith one way or the other, but in my mind, like, either way is kind of bizarre, right? Like there's no, you can't really say, oh, I think we're trained by society and school and scientists to say it's okay to accept that this weird phenomenon that doesn't have any kind of real solid explanation, but because that's solid science. But then when someone starts talking about something that doesn't fit that mold, then we're like, oh no, that's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, belief is a trap,
Mm-hmm.
and scientists are believers in materialism.
Mm-hmm.
And just like any believer, it's all the same, whether it's a religious fundamentalist, or whether it's talking about his God and his religious beliefs, or whether it's a scientist talking about materialism. It's the same sort of thing. Scientists are believers in materialism, and like you say, they make stuff up in order to keep materialism, you know, a going thing in their minds. So my idea about belief is that we need to get rid of them all. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we don't need belief. Beliefs are traps.
Right.
If you believe something, now you will no longer entertain information to the contrary. You've just shut yourself off from learning anything else because you have a belief. And when you have a belief about how something works, then you're done. So they're all, I call them in my book, belief traps.
Mm-hmm.
And any belief is like that, be it materialism, or be it some other kind of fundamentalism. It Anytime you have a belief about the way you think things have to be, you've just cut yourself off from really being able to process information contrary to that belief. Because as information comes to you contrary to that belief, you'll just, you know, brush it away. You'll say, oh, that's nonsense. That couldn't possibly be true because it's not what I believe.
Right.
Well, that's kind of, if you look at it that way, then you realize that, if you're a believer, then you also feel kind of omniscient. What I believe must be true. And that's why, you said that a lot of people listening to this program are going to say, that's crazy. That stuff doesn't make any sense. Out of body stuff. That's all a bunch of nonsense. Well, they're stuck in a belief trap. They've got a belief that, this is a material world and that's all there is to it. And if that's their belief, then anything else, they'll just brush aside as being nonsense. So the other part to that thing about you should always be skeptical is that you should also always be open-minded.
Right.
So that's the set. Be open-minded,
The
but be
both. Yeah.
skeptical at the same time. If you're
Exactly.
both of those, then eventually you'll get to the right answer.
Yeah. No,
But
it
you
makes,
can't,
yeah.
yeah, you can't be one without the other. If you're
Right.
only open-minded and not skeptical,
Right.
you'll end up, taking a path down la la land, and it'll be all nonsense.
Right.
But if you're skeptical without being open-minded, then you're just trapped in the beliefs that you got from your culture and that you got out of your textbooks, and you won't be able to go past it.
Yeah.
So you got to be both. You have to be open-minded and say, just set probabilities on things. Say, well, I give this a 10% chance that it might be true.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then start getting information, study it, find out. And maybe that 10% will run to 30%, and study it some more, and so on. And if you don't study it anymore, then just keep it there at that 30%. That's okay.
Yeah.
But
You
that's
don't have
not,
to have an
no,
answer.
you don't have to get to it's true or it's not true answer. You got to live
Right.
gracefully with uncertainty. You got to let things be and say, well, okay, I don't know, and that's okay, but I'll be open for new information, and I'll look into it if there is new information,
Yeah.
but I'm not coming to any conclusions one way or the other. Now, that is the scientific way to, look at life, not, oh, I believe it's materialism, and if it doesn't fit the materialism belief, then it's trash.
Right.
Throw it away. You see, that's just closed-minded, belief junk, and that's not good science at all. That's really, really bad science.
My favorite Tony Robbins quote is the quality of your life is in direct proportion to the amount of uncertainty you can comfortably live with. And I think that fits the case. Like it
Yeah.
matches so well, because if you can comfortably live with uncertainty, your life is a lot better. It's those certainties that seem to be the things that hurt us, right? That cause
Yeah.
us so much trouble, agitation.
Yeah, well, those uncertainties drive us into beliefs. If we're
Mm,
uncertain and we can't stand it because we have a fear of what
right,
we don't know, we have fear of the unknown, so we want to know it. Well, then we just make something up and then we pretend that that's it and we know it, and that gets rid of that fear. So it's those uncertainties drive us toward beliefs, and then the beliefs cut us off from ever growing beyond, that belief. It kind of stops us in our tracks there. So yeah, those are big problems.
Now, there's one question I've been wanting to ask you since I read your book, which because it's kind of funny, like things just I don't believe in coincidences. I believe everything happens for a reason, and like there's a reason why things happen in a particular sequence. I think around the time that I was reading your book, I was also reading a book. Maybe like a month or so earlier, by Joseph Brenner called an Impersonal God. Have you read that book?
No, no, I
You
haven't.
might be interested in that book, but it was really interesting because the book is written in a way that almost like it's God speaking to you, telling you that you're just a cell of his body, and that there's just one consciousness, and that you're just his consciousness, and
Uh-huh.
you're just like when I read your book, I was like the individual consciousness units. So I was like, oh, okay, this is like it's the same thing, and it just made me really connect, like just like all these ideas, the Eastern philosophy of of oneness, these like they all seem to like fit together in this idea that everything is a virtual reality. Because if that's the case, if consciousness is the co- computation, the machine or the computer, if consciousness is we're individual consciousness units, it all kind of fits together into that whole thing. So I was just curious on what your take on your theory, and then how that relates to kind of Eastern philosophy, kind of this idea of oneness type of
Yeah. It, just as you say, it ties it all together. So this my big toe set of books, that not only gives you a model of consciousness and a better model of physics, but it also gives you a model of psychology and
Mhm.
theology and a lot of other things.
Right,
So the things that you always wondered about and thought, yeah, well, but yeah, I'm not gonna, I don't believe that, all those things. Now you have some information as to what those things meant and whether they're credible or not. You can understand it. You go back 2,500 years to the Buddha saying that this world was an illusion. This
right,
physical world is an illusion. Well, that's as close as you can get to saying that it's a virtual reality.
right.
It's not
Exactly.
really the physical hard stuff you think it is. It's just an illusion. And people have known this for forever, because you find this out by being able to explore inner space, not outer space. If you
Mhm.
explore the inner space of your own consciousness and become able to um, go explore with that consciousness, the larger conscious system, then you can figure a lot of these things out. They're kind of self-evident. Well, Buddha and thousands of other people have done that, because they may not have had the technology to get to outer space, but every human is born with the technology to get to inner space.
True.
You see, so this has happened for a long time, over many, many centuries. So we have these little bits and pieces of truth that have kind of bubbled up over the ages about the nature of reality, and they've come from people who have found out firsthand, how that works. So it's not too surprising that they all kind of pull together. So my big toe is different in the sense that up until now, the descriptions of this larger reality always had to be in terms of poetry. It always had to be in terms of description, like it being an illusion. These were descriptive things. They were describing what it is they saw and what it meant to them. This is the first time that it's actually been put down as science, as a logical stream, not as poetry, which you have to interpret. People will read the Gita, and they will interpret it 100 different ways. And that's
Right.
how you end up with different sects, in Buddhism, because in different sects in Christianity, because they interpret the basics many different ways. Well, mine is not an interpretation. Mine is just logic. It's science. It says, I have two assumptions, and one is that consciousness exists, because that's pretty obvious. Here we are,
Right.
conscious. And the other one is that evolution exists. That just means that systems that can change will change to more to adapt to their environments. It's just that simple. So with those two things, then I logically derive everything else, right down to quantum mechanics and relativity. So that's the difference. Is I'm not saying I haven't come to conclusions that are that different from what the Buddha came to.
Right.
You said
Exactly.
2,500 years ago. They're basically the same. A lot of it's a similar conclusions, but I've just put it in terms of logic and science rather than in terms of poetry. So it's
Right.
not a matter of having to interpret it right. It's a matter of just follow logic and it'll take you there.
Well, Tom, I would love to continue this conversation. I could probably talk to you for another hour or two easily, but I have got I've got an appointment that I scheduled after this, so I'm gonna have to wrap it up here. But I definitely want let's I'm gonna put some links. Maybe if you can send me the link for your Kickstarter, I'll put a link here. I'll where I'm pointing out in the cards, and I'll put one in the description below because I definitely want to see those experiments get done. I'm going to contribute to the Kickstarter as well, and then I'll put links to your books on your Big Theory of Everything, and yeah, anything else that that you want me to let
Well,
people know?
yeah, not only put links to the books, but also let people know that the books are free on Google Books. If they don't want to buy them, they can read them for free.
Okay,
If
okay,
they go, if
perfect.
they go to Google Books, and they should go to YouTube. And if they go to YouTube and put my name in there, or
I'll link to
yeah,
your channel too.
yeah, okay, then that's a good place. I've got like 500 videos on YouTube that
Okay.
will take you the rest of your life to to look at. But in any case, that's a good place for information. So, sure, it's been nice. Thank you for the invitation. We did a very short thing here, but hopefully it'll make some of your readers think about the world a little differently, or at least spur a little curiosity to go along with that skepticism.
Yeah, I hope so. I really like that viewpoint, like you said, of being open-minded but skeptic at the same time, and also just seeing things in probabilities, right? Because I think one of the things that's one I was a poker player for a long time, and that was one that I learned to see the world that way. And so it's like sometimes people are like, oh, John's drinking the Kool-Aid on this or that. I'm like, no, it's just like probability. Like this could be true, so I'm going to entertain it to some degree. So,
Yeah.
but I like that viewpoint. So. All right, Tom. Well, yeah, it was awesome talking to you. And yeah, have a good rest of the day.
Okay, you too.